Waveform dB. Same sound, different picture. I often get asked, does my audio look okay? It's kind of a funny question. What does audio look like anyway? More on the waveform in this audition of Stuart's Audacity tips. Before we dig in, I'm reasonably sure this tip will be useful for you. I bet you know someone else who would feel the same if you sent it to them. Go ahead. I won't go anywhere while you're forwarding it. In the last SAT, I talked about the waveform display in Audacity and how weak and strong waveforms look. I also talked about the amplitude scale at the left end of the track, which displays a scale from -1 to 1, centered on 0 in the middle of the track. While this scale displays some useful information, there's another that can be even more useful. The Waveform dB scale. In Audacity 2.4.2, you can turn on this scale by right-clicking on the scale itself and clicking on dB. In 2.3.x, use the drop-down labeled Audio Track at the top of the track header and click on Waveform dB. With this scale selected, the waveform looks much fatter than before. Here's the same waveform displayed in linear, Audacity's default, on the top, and dB on the bottom. The two waveforms look different because dB is a logarithmic scale. That just means that for every unit on the scale, the perceived loudness changes by a multiple of that unit. On the linear scale, every unit represents the same amount of change, so the waveforms look different, even though they represent exactly the same sound. But that's not really the important part. When using the dB scale, the numbers on the scale provide information that anyone in the audio recording world will recognize. The scale centers at -72 and goes to 0 at the top and bottom. This is because -72 dB is the option I've selected for meter dB range in Preferences interface. If you change that preference, restart Audacity to see the new value when you record new tracks. If we expand the vertical height of the track, more numbers appear on the scale. Here's a sample from an audiobook in which the requirement was to limit peaks to -3 dB, zoomed in on the vertical scale far enough to see 1 dB markers. You'll never actually need to zoom in this far on a waveform, but I wanted to show the numbers on the scale. The red line, which I added to the screenshot, follows the -3 dB boundary, and it's easy to see that this sample stays within that boundary. So the dB scale lets us see the waveform in industry standard terms, which is great when trying to meet delivery specs given by a client. But I still like to edit in linear mode. I find it easier to recognize shapes in that waveform. Use whichever works for you.